The early 20th century was a turbulent time for the Victorian Railways. Whilst externally it looked grand with a network and coverage unparalleled in Australia, internally it was hemorrhaging money on massive and overbuilt lines made in the rail mania of the late 19th century. It was here, in 1920, where Sir Harold Winthrop Clapp took over as Chairman of Commissioners for the Victorian Railways. The Clapp era is widely heralded as the most successful and prosperous years of the VR, and one day, just maybe, I'll do an in-depth video on it. It is a product of the cost-saving measures taken during this era that we are here to explore today. So settle in as we explore the history of the Victorian Railways AEC Railmotor. As chairman, Clapp was responsible for a major overhaul in the Victorian Railways motive power. The heavy C, S and even H-class locomotives can all be attributed back to Clapp's desire to modernise and refine operation in the state. But Clapp did not limit the railways to steam and showed a unique interest in alternate forms of motive power. When Clapp took over the railways in 1920, it was in the middle of an electrification scheme initiated by his predecessor, Sir Thomas James Tate. Clapp would initiate the acquisition of several electric locomotives, the first in the country, in 1923. Clapp also sought to acquire a collection of rail motors to run on country or light suburban lines, replacing the existing locomotive hold, dedicated or mixed passenger services. These would be far from the VR's first rail motors, with the railways having run motors in some capacity for the last 40 years. However, they would mark the first standardised sets to be acquired out of one or two examples. It would also mark a transition to the internal combustion engine, with cheaper petrol engines displacing the earlier steam engines. Clapp would see the introduction of 3 new classes of rail motors, each bigger than the other and suited to serve different routes. The largest was the long-lasting 220 horsepower petrol-electric rail motor, later the diesel-electric rail motor, which would enter service in 1928. In the middle there was the 100 horsepower double-ended rail motor, which would enter service earlier in 1925. The final and main topic of this video was the tiny 45 horsepower AEC rail motor, built as the smallest version to serve the most underutilised lines. In total, 19 AEC rail motors were constructed from 1922 to 1925. Alongside this, 24 trailer units were constructed. There were practically 3 variants of the motor and 2 variants of the trailer, only varying in seating arrangement with some exceptions. The variants of the motor are as follows: first class only, seating 32 first class passengers; second class only, seating 37 second class passengers; and mixed class, seating 10 first class and 22 second class passengers. In total, 7 first class only, 8 second class only, and 4 mixed class motors were built. The numbering of these are shown on screen. For trailers, details are much more scarce. The 2 variants both seated 24 second class passengers and were externally identical, with the only difference being the internal wall that divided the guard's compartment. On some trailers it was located directly in front of the rear door, providing the guard with his own separate compartment and access to the rest of the trailer through an internal door. For the other trailers it was shifted forward 3 windows, with some passenger seating being located within the guard's compartment. While this may seem odd, it does have a good reason. Services that were run by the AEC motors were rarely booked to capacity, and it was these seats that would be the last to be booked in any case. That meant that when it wasn't booked, which was most of the time, there would be a large space in the rear of the trailer where mail or other light goods could be safely stowed for the journey. In total, 3 trailers were built with a small compartment, 19 with a large compartment, and the configuration of the remaining 2 is unclear. All of the motors were powered by a 45 horsepower Associated Equipment Company petrol engine. The engine was started by a manual crank mounted on the very tip of the train, just below the radiator and above the cowcatcher. It is my understanding that this engine was driven by a manual transmission and was shifted by a stick in the driver's cab, a rarity for Victoria. All of this was mounted on a light steel chassis with 2 axles. Only the rear axle was powered, with the forward axle remaining as an unpowered leader. The first 15 of these chassis were assembled in England by the AEC and then imported to Australia for the VR. The next 3 were assembled locally at Newport by the VR. The final motor, number 19, was built by a local firm run by Mr. H. Knuckley of Newport. The body of the motor was of fully timber construction with 7 windows and rows of seats. A double door was located on the front of the cabin, just behind the driver's cab. The driver had a door on either side and 4 forward windows. The middle 2 of these windows were able to slide, allowing the driver to open the windscreen for ventilation and cooling. All but one of the bodies were constructed in Newport workshops by the VR, with the exception once again being Motor 19, which was built by Mr. H. Knuckley's firm. There exists a set of two rather interesting illustrations of the motor bodies being constructed in Newport, showing how they were built. These images are interesting as they're likely tracings or poor copies of real photographs, and I would be curious to see if the original photos still exist. The body of Motor 1 is visibly different to that of later motors, with a flat roof and a slightly different cabin shape. The frame around the front of the motor was also different, most notably with smaller mudguards and a much larger ladder for accessing the front door. The motor also lacked any windows on the passengers area, with them being replaced with fabric curtains that could drape down to cover the windows. From my understanding, all 24 trailers were constructed and assembled in-house at Newport. Externally, they were identical, with two axles on a steel frame. There seems to be a single exception to this, trailer number 1. This trailer was exceptionally short and once again lacked windows. I suspect this was likely a pathfinder to test before later designs. The first motor, Motor number 1, was built and introduced into service in 1922. It was followed by numbers 2 through 7 in 23, 8 through 13 in 24, and 14 through 19 in 25. For trailers, number 1 was assembled in 1922, numbers 2 through 7, as well as 13 for some reason, were assembled in 1923, numbers 8 through 12 were in 1924, 14 through 19 in 25, 20 through 22 in 1926, and then 23 was built in 1927, and 24 in 1928. Practically immediately after introduction, Motor 1 was sent north to Mallee to operate railcar services out of Mildura. It, alongside its trailer, ran services from Mildura to Yalta, Red Cliffs and Morcalla. It also likely ran services all the way south to Oyen and Pinaroo. The poor frequencies of these lines, often only a few times weekly, meant that the motor could afford to run around and serve areas all over the northwest. Quickly after entering service, one of the biggest deficiencies of the motor car became apparent. The engine had a nasty habit of overheating in service, requiring time to cool down again before continuing on. This was likely caused by the hot dry weather of regional Victoria where the motors would run. This was remedied by crews opening the engine covers, allowing the engine more direct airflow. Soon, several more rail motors would enter service along other regional lines. When the Whittlesea line was electrified to Reservoir in 1921, there became a need to provide a shuttle service from Reservoir out to the terminus at Whittlesea. In 1924, the decision was made to use the AEC motor for this purpose. A single motor car without a trailer was ran. For this purpose, the VR had to install a turntable at Reservoir, as the AEC could not run for long durations in reverse. Whittlesea already had a turntable, so no alterations were required there. In 1929, the electrification was extended through to Thomastown, but due to the lack of a turntable, the rail motor continued to be operated via Reservoir. This was resolved in 1931 when it was replaced with a perm rail motor. The double-ended nature of this new motor meant that services could now terminate at Thomastown, and the turntable at Reservoir would soon be removed, and that at Whittlesea would follow soon after. Several motors were sent north to Bendigo and Echuca, where they would operate out to Swan Hill, Kohana, Deniliquin, and Toowoomba. In this regional area, small turntables were plentiful, so the installation of new turntables was not required. These services began around 1925, and several motors and trailers were sent north to provide for it. Motor number 10 spent time in Frankston serving the Mornington and Red Hill lines. It would, at times, have several trailer units. An AEC motor was also used out to Orbost on the far reaches of the Gippsland line. An interesting use of the AEC motor was on the Deepdene line, where it provided yet another shuttle service from Riversdale to Deepdene. This section of line was originally intended to be electrified, but the plan was shelved in 1926. As a result, a pair of AEC motors were coupled back to back, removing the need for a turntable. Only the leading motor would provide power, and the driver would simply switch ends at each terminus. This interesting configuration would disappear quickly as the Deepdene passenger service closed just 12 months later in late 1927. By far the most famous and longest lasting use of the AEC motor was the shuttle from Fawkner to Somerton. This line had been closed since 1903, but was reopened by the railways in 1926 to serve solely passengers. The only station on the line with a platform was at Fawkner, and the rest were merely stopping places. Both ends had a turntable used to spin the motor for the return trip. Originally, all motors remained in the reddish-brown colour of their timber bodies. The frame was painted black and the engine radiator white. They would remain this way for the next 10 years or so, until in the mid-1930s when all the motors were painted with their distinctive white tiger stripes. I can't find the exact reason for these stripes, but I assume they were for visibility to cars on the many unprotected level crossings in regional Victoria. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the AEC motors were reaching 20 years old and aging fast. It was for this reason that sometime in 1942, rail motor number 11 became the first AEC motor to be removed from service, with its parts likely cannibalised to maintain the remaining motors. Another effect of the war was petrol rationing, limiting the railway's access to fuel their rail motors. As a result, several motors, if not all the motors, were fitted with a simple gas producer unit. These would burn wood or coal to produce a crude petrol substitute, which can be used to run the engine. The only motor I can confirm that was equipped with this was number 14, however most, if not all of the fleet was likely to have had it fitted. The end for the AEC motors was decided almost immediately after World War II, when the decision was made that a new class of rail motors would be made to replace them. These would later be known as the walkers. The gradual replacement began in 1948, when 3 motors, number 3, 7 and 16 were scrapped. This also coincided with the introduction of the first 3 walkers in the same year. The next 7 would go in 1949, and a further 2 would be removed in 1950. Interestingly, number 18, which was removed from service in 1949, was restored and would re-enter service in late 1950, only to be scrapped a year later in 1951, alongside one other motor. By 1952, only 5 motors remained. Interestingly, at this time, motor number 1, the weird one that's been running around the Mallee for the last 30 years, was briefly converted to diesel. This experiment wouldn't last long, as it, alongside 2 others, were added to the scrap heap in 1953. The remaining 2 motors, number 9 and number 15, both shared operation of the only line still ran using the motor, the aforementioned Fawkner to Somerton shuttle. By this point, they were both over 30 and really showing it. Finally, in February 1955, the final AEC motor, by that point warmly known as the Beetle, ran a service from Fawkner to Somerton. Following this, the 2 motors were placed into storage and the line closed. They were scrapped shortly afterward. The AEC motors had a long and productive life over their 33 years in passenger services. They provided an important stopgap on light passenger lines before the introduction of more economical road coach services. The Associated Equipment Company would never produce another rail vehicle for the Victorian Railways, however they would end up producing the first buses acquired for regional and suburban services in the late 1940s. Thank you for watching. This is the quick outro. The AC motor is a very, very cute little motor. I do like it. I just want to make a quick video on it. It's history. Sorry for the gap between this video and the last video. It's holidays. You know, I could have spent the time making a good at work, good effort on videos, but I didn't. I spent it on holiday. So yeah, I'm working on a few videos now at the moment. I should have at least 1 more out by the end of January, maybe 2, time permitting. But yeah, anyway, thank you for watching. See you soon.